Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping back into Tudor England, but not the glittering court you've seen in movies. We're diving into the story of a girl who became queen at 15, accused of treason at 17, and dead before she turned 18. A girl whose name has been whispered for centuries, always with the same question hanging in the air. Was she a victim? Or was she playing a dangerous game she couldn't win? So before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, pull up your blanket, and let yourself sink into tonight's story. And if you enjoy what you hear, a like or subscribe helps us keep these stories going, but only if it feels right. Now let's ease into the shadows of the Tudor court together. In February 1542, a teenage girl knelt on the scaffold at the Tower of London. She was so small the executioner had to adjust the block. Her hands were shaking. She'd spent the night before practicing, how to lay her head down gracefully so she wouldn't fumble in front of the crowd. She'd been Queen of England just 16 months earlier. Now she was about to die for adultery and treason. Her name dragged through the mud, her body about to be buried in an unmarked grave next to her cousin, Anne Boleyn, another queen who'd lost her head. Her name was Catherine Howard, and depending on who you ask, she was either a naive girl destroyed by the men around her, or a calculating seductress who played a deadly game at the most dangerous court in Europe. But here's what makes her story so haunting. She was a child, and the man who ordered her death, he'd called her his rose without a thorn. What happened between the wedding bed and the execution block will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about power, innocence, and survival in Tudor England. Because Catherine Howard wasn't born to be queen. She wasn't even born to be particularly important. She arrived in the world sometime around 1523 or 1524. No one bothered to record the exact date because girls, especially younger daughters, weren't worth the ink. She was one of many children born to Lord Edmund Howard, a minor nobleman with a famous last name but an empty purse. The Howards were one of England's most powerful families. Her uncle was the Duke of Norfolk, one of Henry VIII's most trusted and most ruthless advisors. But Catherine's father, he was the disappointing brother, the one who couldn't manage money, couldn't climb the political ladder, and couldn't provide for his growing brood of children. Catherine's mother, Joyce Culpeper, died when Catherine was young, probably in childbirth, because that's how women died in Tudor England. Frequently, quietly, without much fuss. And so Catherine, a little girl with auburn hair and dark eyes, was sent away. Shipped off to live in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in a sprawling estate called Chesworth House, in Sussex, and later at Norfolk House in Lambeth. It sounds grand, doesn't it? A duchess's household. But here's the thing about Tudor ladies' households. They weren't boarding schools. They were holding pens for unmarried girls and widows. A chaotic mix of women waiting for marriages, managing estates, or just surviving. And nobody was watching the children. The Dowager Duchess was old, distracted, and more interested in her own affairs than the moral education of a house full of restless young women. She had cataracts forming in her eyes, making her vision cloudy. She went to bed early, exhausted by the demands of managing her estates and her endless squabbles with her stepdaughters over money and property. The girls slept together in a long dormitory, sometimes 4 or 5 to a bed. Privacy didn't exist, neither did supervision. The dormitory was cold, always cold. The walls were stone, and in winter, frost would creep across the inside of the shuttered windows. The girls would huddle together under thin wool blankets that smelled of mildew and body odour. The room smelled like unwashed bodies, chamber pots that hadn't been emptied frequently enough, and the sweet sick scent of the rushes on the floor that hadn't been changed in weeks. By the time Catherine was 12 or 13, still a child by our standards, she was already learning the rules of a different game. Not embroidery and prayers, but flirtation, secrecy, and how to avoid getting caught. Because at night, after the Dowager Duchess went to bed, the girls' dormitory became something else entirely. It's late at night. Maybe 1536, maybe 1537. Catherine is 13, maybe 14. She's small for her age, pretty in a soft, childish way. Round-faced, bright-eyed, eager to be liked. She still has baby fat in her cheeks. Her hands are small, her fingers ink-stained from the letters she's been made to copy as part of her limited education. The other girls in the dormitory are older, bolder. They've been playing this game longer. Someone picks the lock on the door. Maybe it's Joan Bulmer, one of the senior girls, who's 17 and knows things Catherine doesn't. Maybe it's Alice Restwold, who's been sneaking men in for months and has a reputation for being easy. A word Catherine doesn't fully understand yet, but knows is supposed to be shameful. The door swings open with a creak that makes everyone freeze, holding their breath, waiting to see if anyone heard. They didn't. The Dowager Duchess is 3 corridors away, snoring peacefully in her own bed. In slip young men from the household, musicians, secretaries, minor gentry with nothing to lose and everything to prove. They bring wine in leather flasks, apples stolen from the kitchens, sweetmeats wrapped in cloth. The girls giggle and whisper, passing food in the dark, their breaths visible in the freezing room because there's no fire after curfew. Someone lights a single candle, and in its flickering light, Catherine can see couples forming. A girl and a boy disappearing behind the bed curtains. Another pair kissing in the corner, their hands moving in ways that make Catherine's stomach flutter with something between curiosity and fear. Catherine watches. Maybe at first she's nervous. Maybe she feels like she shouldn't be here. But the older girls pull her in. They make her feel special, mature, included. They tell her she's pretty. They tell her she's lucky to have such nice skin, such shiny hair. They pass her wine, and even though it tastes bitter and makes her throat burn, she drinks it because everyone else is drinking. And that's when she meets Henry Mannix. Mannix was a music teacher, a commoner hired to teach the girls how to play the virginals, a small keyboard instrument. He was in his mid-20s, maybe older. Not handsome exactly, but confident in that way that makes young girls feel noticed. He had dark hair and quick hands, always moving, always gesturing, always finding reasons to touch. He was older, charming, and he paid attention to Catherine in a way that made her feel seen. During the day, the lessons were proper. Mannix would sit beside Catherine on the bench, guiding her fingers across the keys, correcting her posture. "Straighten your back," he'd say, his hand pressing against her spine. "Curve your fingers like this," and his hand would close over hers, warm and slightly damp with sweat. Catherine liked the attention. She wasn't used to it. Her father had never noticed her. Her mother was dead. The Dowager Duchess barely remembered her name half the time. But Mannix? Mannix looked at her like she mattered. At 13, Catherine Howard didn't know what grooming looked like. She didn't have the language for it. All she knew was that someone thought she was special. Mannix would compliment her during lessons. "You have a natural talent," he'd say. "Such delicate fingers, such grace." He'd stay after the other girls left, helping her with difficult passages, his breath warm against her ear as he hummed the melody. And then came the night visits. Mannix started appearing in the dormitory after dark. Not every night, but often enough. He'd bring her small gifts, a ribbon, a dried flower, once a small silver ring that was probably worth nothing but felt like everything to a 13-year-old girl who'd never owned anything of value. The other girls would giggle and whisper. "He likes you," they'd say. "He thinks you're beautiful." And Catherine, desperate to be liked, desperate to be special, let it continue. One night, Mannix pulled her behind the bed curtains. The space was narrow, barely enough room for 2 people. Catherine could hear the other girls whispering on the other side of the fabric, could hear someone laughing, could hear the rustle of clothes and the creak of the bed ropes. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. Mannix kissed her. His mouth tasted like wine. And something else, something sour. His hands moved over her body, touching her in places no one had ever touched her before. Catherine didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she was supposed to like it or if she was supposed to push him away. The older girls had made it sound exciting, romantic, but this felt uncomfortable, confusing. His hands were rough, his breathing heavy in her ear. "You're so beautiful," he whispered. "So special. I've never met anyone like you." And Catherine, 13 years old and desperate to believe him, let him continue. We don't know exactly what happened between them. Later, under interrogation, Catherine would admit they'd been intimate, but swore they hadn't gone all the way. Mannix, trying to save his own skin, claimed they had. The truth? Probably somewhere in the middle. What we do know is this: whatever happened between them left Catherine confused. She didn't feel the way the older girls had said she would feel. She didn't feel romantic or mature or special. She felt used, but she didn't have the words for that feeling. And when she tried to confide in the other girls, they laughed. "That's just how it is," they said. "You'll get used to it." So Catherine told herself she was in love, because that's what girls were taught to call it. That's what made it acceptable. That's what turned something confusing and uncomfortable into something she could live with. The relationship with Mannix continued for months. Sometimes he was sweet, bringing her gifts and whispering compliments. Other times he was demanding, pulling her into dark corners, his hands moving over her body, whether she wanted them to or not. And Catherine, confused and isolated and desperate to be loved, went along with it, until someone noticed. Maybe the Dowager Duchess heard whispers. Maybe one of the other girls got jealous and threatened to tell. Maybe Catherine herself tried to pull away, and Mannix got angry. We don't know exactly what ended it, but it ended badly. Mannix was dismissed from the household. Catherine was scolded, though not severely. After all, she was just a child. It was the man who should have known better. But the damage was done. Catherine had learned something dangerous, that men would pay attention to her if she let them touch her. That love and pain and confusion could all exist together. That her body was something she could trade for affection, even if that affection didn't feel the way she thought it was supposed to. She was 14 years old, and the education she'd received wasn't in music or letters or household management. It was in survival, in the currency of the female body, in the terrible truth that in a world ruled by men, a girl's value was measured by what she could give away. But the situation with Mannix didn't last. Maybe the Dowager Duchess found out. Maybe the other girls got jealous. Maybe Catherine herself realised Mannix wasn't going to marry her, because he couldn't. He was a commoner. She was a Howard, no matter how minor her branch of the family tree. Either way, by the time Catherine was 15, Mannix was out of the picture. And Francis Derham was in. Derham was different. He wasn't a music teacher or a servant. He was a gentleman, low-ranking, sure, but still part of the gentry. He had prospects. He had a salary as a member of the Dowager Duchess's household staff. He had connections. And most importantly, he could theoretically marry her. Not a brilliant match, but a possible one. Derham was in his 20s, handsome, confident, and he knew exactly what he wanted. He'd been watching Catherine for weeks, maybe months. He'd seen her with Mannix. He'd seen how the other girls treated her, half mocking, half envious. He'd seen a young girl desperate for affection, easy to manipulate, easier to control. He was methodical about it. First came the compliments, carefully calibrated to make her feel mature. "You're not like the other girls," he'd say. "You're more sophisticated, more intelligent." He brought her better gifts than Mannix had. Fabric for a new dress, coins so she could buy sweetmeats at the market, once a pair of gloves that were soft and expensive. He made her feel chosen, special, like she was the only girl in the world who mattered. And Catherine, still bruised from whatever had happened with Mannix, still desperate to believe that what she'd felt was love and not something else, fell for it completely. The nighttime visits to the dormitory continued, but now, instead of Mannix whispering in her ear, it was Derham. And this time, things escalated quickly. Derham was more aggressive than Mannix had been. more possessive. He called her his wife, not officially, not legally, but in the dormitory, in the dark, he'd whisper it against her skin. "You're my wife, Catherine. Mine, say it." And Catherine, 15 years old, and convinced this was love, would whisper back, "I'm yours." They exchanged gifts like a betrothed couple. He gave her money, fabric, ribbons. She gave him, well, herself, her body, her trust, everything she had. Catherine was 15, maybe 16, still so young, still so desperate to believe that this time it was real, that Derham loved her, that they would get married, that this was the beginning of her life, not the destruction of it. They had sex, multiple times, in a dormitory full of other girls, some of whom were asleep, some of whom were awake and pretending not to notice. The bed ropes would creak, the straw mattress would rustle. Catherine would bury her face in the pillow, trying to be quiet, trying not to wake the girls sleeping 2 feet away. Sometimes Derham would cover her mouth with his hand. "Shh," he'd whisper. "You don't want anyone to hear, do you?" In Tudor England, this kind of relationship, if both parties agreed to marry and consummated the relationship, could technically be considered a pre-contract, a binding, legal marriage, as valid as one performed in a church. But here's the thing, Catherine never called it that. She probably didn't even realise the legal weight of what she was doing. She was a teenager who thought she was in love, and the people around her, the older women, the servants, the other girls, they all knew. They saw. Some of them even helped, smuggling Derham in and out, giggling as they played lookout. Joan Bulmer would stand by the door, listening for footsteps. Catherine Tilney would cough loudly if she heard someone approaching. Margaret Bennet would create distractions, making noise on the other side of the room, so the Dowager Duchess's maid wouldn't hear what was happening in the corner. No one stopped it, no one protected her. Because in the Tudor world, a girl's virginity was a commodity, but only if she was important enough to be worth guarding. And at 15, Catherine Howard wasn't important. Not yet. She was just another girl in a crowded dormitory, doing what girls did, making the mistakes that girls made. Except when you're Catherine Howard, those mistakes don't stay in the past. They follow you, they hunt you, and eventually they kill you. But before that happens, before everything falls apart, Catherine has to become someone worth destroying. She has to become a queen. While Catherine Howard was fumbling through adolescence in a chaotic dormitory in Lambeth, learning the wrong lessons from the wrong people, the King of England was having a midlife crisis, and when Henry VIII had a crisis, people died. By 1539, Henry was a mess. He was 48 years old, which in Tudor terms made him ancient. His once athletic body, the body that had jousted and hunted and danced all night, had thickened into bloated obesity. He weighed nearly 400 pounds, his waist measuring over 50 inches. His leg ulcer, a festering wound from a jousting accident years earlier, oozed constantly, filling rooms with the smell of rotting flesh. The wound had never healed properly, and by now it was chronic, infected, draining pus and dead tissue that had to be cleaned out daily by physicians who could barely hide their disgust. The smell was indescribable. Imagine rotting meat mixed with the sweet sick scent of infection, overlaid with the perfumes and pomanders courtiers used to try to mask it. The whole court reeked of it. Henry's chambers reeked of it. His clothes, no matter how often they were changed, carried the scent. When he walked through a room, people knew he was coming before they saw him, just from the smell. He'd been married 4 times. 2 wives were dead. Catherine of Aragon had died abandoned and heartbroken in 1536, still insisting she was his true wife. Anne Boleyn had been beheaded the same year on charges of adultery, incest and treason that most historians now agree were fabricated. One wife, Jane Seymour, had died in 1537, just 12 days after giving birth to the son he'd torn England apart to get. And his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, had just been discarded after 6 months of marriage because Henry found her physically repulsive. The Anne of Cleves situation had been a disaster from the start. Henry had agreed to marry her sight unseen, based on a portrait painted by Hans Holbein. But when Anne arrived in England in January 1540, Henry was horrified. He called her a Flanders mare and complained that she had body odour and bad breath. Whether this was true, or whether Henry was just looking for excuses to get out of a political marriage he no longer wanted, we'll never know. Either way, Henry refused to consummate the marriage, and by July 1540 they were divorced. Henry was aging, paranoid, in constant pain, and desperate to feel young again. His court, once a place of music and dancing and youthful energy, had become sombre, cautious. Everyone walked on eggshells around the king, never knowing when his mood would turn black, when a casual comment would be interpreted as treason, when he'd order another arrest, another execution. His counsellors were worried. England needed stability, and stability meant heirs. Prince Edward was only 3 years old, sickly and fragile. If he died, England would be thrown into chaos. Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, was declared illegitimate. Elizabeth, his daughter by Anne Boleyn, was also declared illegitimate. Henry needed more sons, and to get more sons, he needed a new wife. But who would marry him now? Everyone knew what happened to Henry's wives. 2 dead, 1 divorced and humiliated, 1 discarded after 6 months. What woman would willingly step into that role? Enter Catherine Howard. Catherine arrived at court in late 1539, brought there by her ambitious uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. The Howards had been sidelined after Anne Boleyn's execution. She'd been a Howard too, and her downfall had nearly destroyed the family. Norfolk himself had sat on the jury that condemned his own niece to death. He'd voted guilty without hesitation, putting political survival above family loyalty. But Norfolk was nothing if not persistent. He'd waited, watched, rebuilt his influence slowly, carefully. And when Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves started to crumble, Norfolk saw an opportunity. He needed a new Howard girl at court, someone young, pretty, and pliable, someone who could charm the king and restore the family's power, someone who wouldn't be difficult or demanding like Anne Boleyn had been. Catherine fit the bill perfectly. She was probably 16, maybe 17, short, barely 5 feet tall, plump in the way Tudor men found attractive, soft, curvy, youthful. She had reddish-brown hair, the Howard colouring, dark eyes that seemed to sparkle when she laughed, and a sweetness about her, a guilelessness that men found disarming. She wasn't intellectual like Anne Boleyn, who'd argued theology with bishops and mocked the king's advisors. She wasn't pious like Catherine of Aragon, who'd spent hours praying and reading devotional texts. She wasn't foreign and awkward like Anne of Cleves. She was fun, light-hearted. She giggled easily, danced well, and knew how to make a man feel interesting. She'd ask questions about hunting or politics and listen with wide-eyed fascination, even though she probably didn't understand or care about the answers. She was exactly what Henry wanted. Young, pretty, and most importantly, she made him feel young. And Henry their hero, bloated and insecure and desperate to recapture the glory of his youth, noticed her immediately. At first it was just attention, a smile across the room, a compliment on her dress, maybe a small gift, a ribbon, a ring, something relatively insignificant. But for Catherine, who'd spent her whole life being overlooked, who'd grown up in a chaotic household where she was just one of many girls competing for scraps of attention, suddenly finding herself at the centre of the most powerful man in England's gaze was intoxicating. She didn't think about Manox or Derham. She didn't think about the fumbling encounters in the dormitory, the shame she'd felt when Manox was dismissed, the confusion she still carried about whether what had happened with Derham was love or something else. She thought, this is it. This is my chance. This is how I matter. The Duke of Norfolk thought the same thing. He began orchestrating opportunities for Catherine and Henry to interact, seating her near him at banquets, making sure she was present at dances, coaching her probably on what to say and how to act, laugh at his jokes, compliment his hunting. Don't talk about politics or religion. Just be sweet. Just be pretty. Just be available. And Catherine, eager to please, eager to succeed, eager to finally be someone instead of no one, played her part perfectly. By spring 1540, Henry was infatuated. He started calling Catherine his rose without a thorn, a pointed insult to Anne of Cleves, whom he'd just humiliated and divorced. The court noticed. Everyone noticed. Whispers spread through the corridors. The king has a new favourite, another Howard girl. Poor thing, doesn't she know what happened to the last one? But if Catherine heard the whispers, she ignored them. She was going to be different. She wasn't going to make Anne Boleyn's mistakes. She wasn't going to be difficult or demanding. She was going to make Henry happy. And in return, he would love her, protect her, give her everything she'd never had. She was so naive, it's almost painful. And on July 28, 1540, less than 3 weeks after his marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace. There was no grand celebration, no public announcement, just a quiet wedding in front of a handful of witnesses, because Henry had learned that too much ceremony made it harder to undo things later, if necessary. Catherine Howard, the girl who'd been pawned off to her step-grandmother's chaotic household, the girl who'd been groped by her music teacher and seduced in a dormitory, the girl whose father couldn't afford to give her a dowry, was now Queen of England. She was 16, maybe 17 years old, and she had no idea what she'd just signed up for. Let's talk about the wedding night, because this is where the fairy tale dies completely. Catherine Howard was probably a virgin when she married Henry, or at least she convinced herself she was. What had happened with Manox and Dereham didn't count, right? That was before. That was a different life. This was her real life beginning. The bedding ceremony was a public affair, as all royal beddings were. Catherine was prepared by her ladies-in-waiting, stripped, bathed, perfumed, dressed in a thin nightgown. Her hair was brushed out, loose around her shoulders. She was led to the marriage bed, a massive thing with heavy curtains and mountains of pillows, while courtiers watched and made crude jokes about the consummation to come. Henry arrived, also in his nightgown, his massive body barely contained by the fabric. And then the curtains were drawn, giving them privacy. But not real privacy. The witnesses waited outside, listening, ready to confirm that the marriage had been properly consummated. We don't know exactly what happened that night, but we can imagine. Catherine, barely 17, small and soft and terrified, lying in bed with a man who weighed 3 times what she did, whose body was covered in sores and infections, whose breath was sour from his rotting teeth, whose leg wound smelled like death. Henry was impotent, or mostly impotent. His physicians would later testify that he had difficulty achieving and maintaining an erection, probably due to his obesity, his leg infection, and his generally poor health. This had been a problem with Anne of Cleves, and it likely continued with Catherine. But Henry couldn't admit that, so instead he'd blame his wives. They weren't attractive enough. They didn't arouse him. It was their fault, not his. Catherine did her duty. She lay still while Henry pawed at her with his swollen fingers. She tried not to flinch at the smell, tried not to cry at the pain when he finally managed to penetrate her. She told herself this was what love was. This was what marriage was. This was the price of being queen. And when it was over, when Henry rolled off her, panting and sweating, she told him it was wonderful. Because that's what girls were taught to do. Lie. Make the man feel powerful, virile, satisfied, even when the reality was anything but. The witnesses were satisfied that the marriage had been consummated. Catherine was officially Queen of England, and the nightmare had only just begun. Being Queen of England sounds like a fairy tale. It wasn't. Catherine Howard's life as Queen was a performance, and she was on stage every single minute of every single day. She woke up surrounded by ladies in waiting, who dressed her, bathed her, and reported everything she said back to their families. She ate meals in public, attended mass in public, smiled in public. Even her bedroom wasn't private. Her ladies slept on trundle beds around her, ready to serve her at any moment. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical day looked like for Catherine Howard, Queen of England. She'd wake at dawn, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Morning prayers were mandatory. Her ladies would swarm around her bed, pulling back the curtains, helping her into a robe, guiding her to her prie-dieu, a prayer desk, where she'd kneel and recite the morning office. Her knees would ache from kneeling on the hard wood. The room would be freezing, because even royal bedchambers weren't well heated. And Catherine, still half asleep, would shiver through the prayers. Then came the dressing. And this wasn't a quick process. Catherine couldn't dress herself. Queens didn't. Her ladies would strip off her nightgown and chemise, leaving her standing naked while they examined her body for any signs of pregnancy. Because that was the Queen's primary job, getting pregnant. Every month, her ladies would watch for signs. Were her breasts tender? Was she nauseous? Had her monthly courses stopped? The scrutiny was constant, invasive, humiliating. Once they'd determined she wasn't pregnant, and month after month she wasn't, they'd begin the elaborate process of dressing her. First the chemise, then the kirtle, then the gown, a heavy thing made of velvet or silk, embroidered with gold thread, weighing probably 30 or 40 pounds. Then the sleeves, which attached separately. Then the jewellery, necklaces, rings, bracelets, all chosen to reflect her status as queen. Then the hood, the distinctive English gable hood that Anne Boleyn had made famous. By the time Catherine was fully dressed, it had been 2 hours since she woke up, and she hadn't been alone for a single second of it. She'd been poked, prodded, scrutinised, dressed like a doll while her ladies gossiped around her, sometimes about her. Then came breakfast, in public, in the great hall where courtiers watched her eat, judging every bite. Queens were expected to eat delicately, sparingly. Too much food, and you'd be called greedy. Too little, and people would whisper that you were pregnant and suffering from morning sickness. Catherine had to navigate this minefield at every meal. After breakfast, there might be a few hours of relative freedom. Relative being the key word. Catherine would retire to her chambers with her ladies to do embroidery, read devotional texts, or practice music. But even here, she wasn't alone. Her ladies were always present, always watching, always reporting back to their families about what the Queen said, what she did, who she favoured. Then came the afternoon audiences, people who wanted to petition the Queen, to ask for favours or intercessions with the King. Catherine, who'd never been trained for this role, who'd never been educated beyond basic literacy, had to sit and listen to complex political requests and pretend she understood what was being asked of her. Her uncle Norfolk had given her some coaching. Smile, be gracious, tell them you'll speak to the King. Don't commit to anything. But it was terrifying. One wrong word, and she could create a political incident. More meals, more public appearances, more smiling, more performing, and all the while, Catherine was supposed to appear happy, graceful, queenly, even though she was exhausted, even though she was lonely, even though she was trapped in a life she'd never been prepared for. And then came the evenings, and Henry, whose mood swings were legendary. Some nights he was jovial, calling for music and dancing, pulling Catherine onto his lap and pouring at her in front of the whole court. Other nights he was morose, his leg throbbing, his temper black, snapping at servants and courtiers alike. Catherine never knew which Henry she'd get, so she learned to read his moods, to adjust her behaviour accordingly. Cheerful when he wanted entertainment, quiet when he wanted peace, sexually available when he wanted that, even though it left her feeling used and empty. She couldn't walk down a corridor without someone following her. She couldn't write a letter without someone reading it. She couldn't have a private conversation without someone listening, and at the centre of it all was Henry. Obsessive, possessive Henry, who wanted her attention constantly. At first, Henry adored her. He showered her with jewels, diamonds, rubies, emeralds. He gave her furs, gowns, estates. He called her his jewel of womanhood and paraded her around court like a trophy. He'd grab her hand in public, pull her close, whisper in her ear. Sometimes his hands would wander, groping her in front of courtiers who would quickly look away, pretending not to notice the king fondling his teenage wife. But he was also 50 years old, obese, and suffering from a rotting leg wound that smelled so badly, servants had to change his bandages multiple times a day. The ulcer never healed. It oozed pus and dead tissue constantly. Sometimes it would close up briefly, and Henry would declare himself cured, only for it to burst open again days later, the infection worse than before. The smell haunted Catherine. It clung to Henry's clothes, to the bedsheets, to her own body after they'd been together. She'd try to wash it off, scrubbing her skin raw with rosewater and soap, but she could still smell it, in her hair, on her hands, everywhere. And Catherine, barely 17, was expected to sleep with him. Not just sleep next to him, but be sexually available to him. Every night, whether she wanted to or not, whether he could perform or not. Let's be clear, this wasn't love. This was duty. This was the price of being queen. Catherine had to share a bed with a man old enough to be her grandfather, whose body was failing in 1,000 small ways. His joints were stiff with arthritis. His breath was foul from infected teeth and gums. Several of his molars had rotted out completely, leaving black holes in his mouth. His skin was mottled and broken out in sores, and the leg, always the leg, wrapped in bandages that had to be changed constantly, leaking fluid that stained through to the outer layers. She smiled. She played the role. She let him paw at her with his swollen ring-covered fingers. She whispered that he was handsome, virile, the best lover she'd ever had, even though he was the only real lover she'd ever had. And the experience was nothing like what she'd imagined love would be. But inside, Catherine was drowning. She was a teenager trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. She couldn't complain, couldn't cry, couldn't admit to anyone that being Queen of England was the loneliest, most terrifying experience of her life. Because if she did, if she showed any sign of unhappiness, it would reflect badly on Henry. And if she reflected badly on Henry, she'd be replaced. Just like Anne of Cleves, just like Anne Boleyn, just like all the wives before her who'd failed to keep Henry satisfied. So she smiled, and she performed, and she died a little more inside every single day. And then she made a choice, or maybe the choice made her. In early 1541, about 6 months into her marriage, the court went on a royal progress, a months-long tour of England where the king and his court travelled from estate to estate, showing off royal power and accepting the hospitality and money of loyal nobles. Royal progresses were supposed to be grand affairs, opportunities for the king to show himself to his people, and for his people to demonstrate their loyalty through elaborate entertainments and expensive gifts. But in reality, they were exhausting, uncomfortable, and dangerous. The court travelled with hundreds of people, nobles, servants, guards, entertainers. The roads were terrible, rutted dirt tracks that turned to mud in the rain. The wagons carrying the royal belongings would get stuck. Sometimes for hours, the whole procession would slow to a crawl. Everyone would arrive at their destination, filthy, exhausted, and irritable. The accommodations varied wildly depending on whose estate they were visiting. Some nobles had grand houses that could comfortably host the royal party. Others had smaller manors that were crowded beyond capacity, with courtiers sleeping 3 or 4 to a bed, servants sleeping in corridors, and everyone competing for limited food and water. And through it all, Catherine was expected to maintain her image as the perfect, gracious queen, smiling through banquets even when the food was barely edible, watching entertainments even when she was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open, sharing a bed with Henry even when they were in strange houses, in uncomfortable beds with courtiers sleeping in the rooms on either side. It was during this progress that everything started to unravel, because Catherine, exhausted and lonely, and desperate for something real in a life that felt like a performance, made a terrible decision. She started meeting someone in secret. His name was Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, which meant he had access to the king at all hours. He was one of Henry's body servants, responsible for helping the king dress, attending to his personal needs, even helping clean and bandage the leg wound. It was an intimate position, one that required discretion and loyalty. Henry trusted Culpeper completely. Culpeper was young, mid-20s, handsome, in a sharp-featured way, charming, and part of Henry's inner circle. He was ambitious, clever, and absolutely ruthless in pursuing what he wanted. He was also dangerous. Culpeper had a history, a violent one. In 1538, just 3 years before Catherine met him, Culpeper and some companions had raped a park keeper's wife in her own home. When a villager tried to intervene, they murdered him. Culpeper was arrested and should have been executed, but Henry pardoned him, because Culpeper was a favourite, because he was useful, because in Henry's court loyalty mattered more than morality. Catherine didn't know this, or maybe she did, and she didn't care, because Culpeper paid attention to her in a way Henry didn't. He was young, he was charming, he didn't smell like death. When he looked at her, he saw her, not the crown on her head or the political alliance she represented. Or at least, that's what Catherine told herself. In reality, Culpeper was probably just as calculating as everyone else at court. Catherine was the queen. Getting close to her meant power, influence, rewards. Whether he genuinely cared for her or whether he was simply using her, we'll never know. Maybe he didn't even know himself. But Catherine, 17 years old and desperate for something real in a life that felt like a performance, fell for him, and that's when the secret meetings began. Let's talk about what actually happened between Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper, because this is where the story splits into 1,000 different interpretations, and the truth, whatever it was, died with them. The meeting started innocently enough, or at least that's what Catherine would later claim. During the royal progress of 1541, as the court moved from estate to estate through the north of England, Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, began arranging secret meetings between Catherine and Culpeper. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was an interesting choice of conspirator. She was the widow of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother, who'd been executed in 1536 on charges of incest with his sister. Jane had been questioned during that investigation, and though she hadn't actively betrayed her husband, she also hadn't saved him. She'd given testimony that was damaging, whether intentionally or not. And after his death, she'd been left in a precarious position, a widow with no children, dependent on the king's mercy for her income and position. By 1540, she was back at court, serving Catherine Howard as a lady-in-waiting. Why did she agree to help arrange these meetings? Maybe she was bored. Maybe she was trying to secure her own position by making herself indispensable to the Queen. Maybe she genuinely thought she was helping a lonely girl find comfort. Or maybe, and this is the darkest possibility, she knew exactly what she was doing and wanted to see another Howard Queen fall. The meetings took place late at night, in back staircases, private chambers, guardrobes, yes, medieval toilets, which is as grim as it sounds. These were small rooms with a wooden seat over a hole that dropped waist down into a pit or moat below. They were private, isolated, and smelled terrible. But in a crowded royal household where privacy was non-existent, they were one of the few places where you could talk without being overheard. Jane would stand guard outside while Catherine and Culpeper talked, and maybe more. The first meeting was probably at Lincoln in early August 1541. The court was staying at the Bishop's Palace, a sprawling complex of buildings with winding corridors and hidden staircases. Jane arranged for Culpeper to slip into the Queen's chambers after everyone had gone to bed. Catherine would later describe how nervous she was, how her hands shook, how she kept looking at the door, terrified that someone would walk in. Culpeper, by contrast, was calm, confident. He sat close to her, close enough that she could smell the scent of his skin, clean unlike Henry's rotting flesh. He spoke to her softly, intimately. He told her she was beautiful, told her she deserved better than Henry, told her he'd been watching her, thinking about her. And Catherine, who hadn't heard words like that since Dereham, who was starved for affection and attention from someone who wasn't 3 times her age and slowly dying, drank it in like water in a desert. They talked for hours that first night, about nothing important, about everything. Catherine told him about her childhood, about growing up in the Dowager Duchess's chaotic household. She probably didn't tell him about Manox or Dereham. That was too dangerous, too shameful. But she told him about feeling invisible, about being sent away by her father, about the loneliness of being queen. And Culpeper listened, or at least he pretended to listen. He held her hand, he stroked her hair, and when it was time for him to leave, before dawn broke, he kissed her, just once, on the lips, quick and sweet and promising. Catherine lay awake for the rest of the night, her heart racing, her mind spinning. What had she done? What was she doing? But also, when could she see him again? The meetings continued. At Pontefract Castle, a grim fortress in Yorkshire, where Richard II had been murdered. At Lincoln again, on the return journey. At each stop on the progress, Jane Boleyn would find a way to sneak Culpeper into Catherine's chambers. Sometimes they'd meet in the Queen's privy chamber, the small private room attached to her bedroom, sometimes in a back staircase. Once, according to later testimony, they met in a guardrobe at 2 a.m, whispering in the dark, while the smell of human waste rose up through the hole beneath them. The meetings grew longer, more intimate. Catherine would later swear under interrogation that they never had sex, that they only talked, held hands, maybe kissed, that she was lonely and Culpeper made her feel seen. And that was all it was, just conversation, just comfort. Culpeper, under torture, said the same thing, that he loved her, that she loved him, that they'd talked about what might happen if Henry died. Would they be together then? But that they'd never consummated the relationship, that they'd been careful, that they'd never crossed that final line. But here's the problem. In Tudor England, intention was treason. You didn't have to sleep with someone to be guilty of adultery if you were the Queen. You just had to want to, and Catherine and Culpeper had wanted to. The evidence was clear in that regard. At one point, probably in late August or early September, Catherine wrote Culpeper a letter. It's one of the only pieces of evidence we have in her own words, written in her own hand. The original letter still survives, kept in the National Archives in London. It's heartbreaking to read, because you can see everything in it. The loneliness, the desperation, the genuine affection, and the absolute naivety of a teenage girl who had no idea she was writing her own death warrant. The letter reads, "Master Culpeper, I heartily recommend me unto you, praying you to send me word how that you do. It was shown me that you are sick, the which thing troubled me very much, till such time that I hear from you praying you to send me word how that you do. For I never longed so much for a thing as I do to see you and to speak with you, the which I trust shall be shortly now. That which doth comfort me very much when I think of it. And when I think again that you shall depart from me again, it makes my heart die to think what fortune I have, that I cannot be always in your company. Yet my trust is always in you that you will be as you have promised me. Yours as long as life endures, Catherine." It's the letter of a lovesick teenager, earnest, unguarded, emotional. But it's also the letter of a queen committing treason. Because by expressing her desire to be with Culpeper, by signing it yours, by essentially admitting that she longed for him more than was proper for a married woman, she'd crossed a line that, in Tudor law, was punishable by death. Did Catherine understand what she was doing? Probably not. She was 17 years old, playing at romance, thinking she was clever and secret. She didn't understand that Jane Boleyn was probably keeping track of these meetings, that servants were gossiping, that courtiers were noticing when the Queen's lady-in-waiting disappeared with one of the high King's gentlemen late at night. That in a court where everyone spied on everyone, there were no real secrets. The meetings continued for months. At each stop on the progress, Catherine would wait anxiously for Jane to arrange another encounter. She'd count the hours until she could see Culpeper again. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say to him. She lived for those stolen moments in the dark, those brief conversations where she felt like herself again. Not the Queen, not the performance, just Catherine. And all the while, the witnesses were adding up. The servants who saw Jane Boleyn sneaking through corridors late at night. The ladies in waiting who noticed the Queen seemed distracted, flushed, secretive. The guards who saw Culpeper leaving the Queen's chambers before dawn. Everyone noticed, everyone gossiped, and no one said anything until someone did. In autumn 1541, the court returned to London. The progress was over. Summer was fading into fall. Catherine probably thought she'd gotten away with it. The meetings had stopped once they returned to London. Too dangerous, too many people watching. Catherine had returned to her regular routine of public appearances and private misery. She probably thought it was over. A summer romance, a brief escape, nothing more. She had no idea that hundreds of miles away, in a quiet house in Sussex, a conversation was taking place that would destroy her. A man named John Lascelles was talking to his sister, Mary Hall, and Mary was telling him a story about a girl she'd known years ago in the Dowager Duchess's household, a girl named Catherine Howard. On All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1541, King Henry VIII attended Mass at Hampton Court Palace. He was in a good mood, relatively speaking. The progress had gone well. His leg was hurting less than usual. He was still besotted with his young queen, and he was planning a lavish banquet to celebrate the successful completion of the royal progress. But while Henry prayed, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer approached him with a letter. Cranmer looked nervous, which was unusual. He was normally unflappable, having survived years of navigating Henry's temperamental moods. But now his hands shook slightly as he handed the letter to the king. The letter had been written by John Lascelles, a Protestant reformer with a grudge against the Catholic Howard family. Lascelles was a zealot, the kind of man who saw enemies everywhere and believed himself to be doing God's work by exposing them. He'd recently spoken with his sister, Mary Hall, who had lived in the Dowager Duchess's household with Catherine years earlier. Mary had been one of the girls in that dormitory. She'd witnessed the nighttime visits. She'd seen Manox and Derham sneaking in and out. She'd heard the whispered conversations and the muffled sounds behind the bed curtains. And now, years later, she'd told her brother everything. About Henry Manox, about Francis Derham, about the nighttime visits, the dormitory, encounters, the gifts, the pet names, the way Catherine had called Derham her husband and he'd called her his wife. Mary Hall claimed she'd seen them in bed together multiple times, that everyone in the household had known, that Catherine Howard, before she'd become queen, had been promiscuous, perhaps even married. Cranmer handed the letter to Henry, and Henry's world exploded. At first, Henry didn't believe it. He couldn't. His rose without a thorn, his perfect young wife, impossible. This had to be lies, fabrications from enemies of the Howard family trying to bring them down. Henry ordered Cranmer to investigate, but discreetly. He wanted to prove the accusations false. He needed them to be false, because if they were true, it meant Henry had been fooled again. It meant another wife had betrayed him. It meant he was a cuckold, a laughingstock, a failure. Cranmer moved quickly. he sent men to find Henry Manox and Francis Dereham. Both were arrested within days, and both, faced with interrogation and the threat of torture, started talking. Manox was arrested first. He was found in London, still working as a music teacher. When the king's men came for him, he knew immediately why. He confessed before they even had to apply pressure. Yes, he admitted, he'd had an inappropriate relationship with Catherine Howard when she was younger, but he was quick to minimize his role. "We were young," he said. "It was nothing serious, just kissing and touching. We never went all the way." He tried to paint himself as a victim of Catherine's seduction, claiming she'd been the one to pursue him. It was a lie, of course, but it was the kind of lie that might save his life. Dereham was arrested next. He was dragged from his lodgings, protesting his innocence. He tried to deny everything at first, but under pressure, and the interrogators had ways of applying pressure, from sleep deprivation to isolation to the threat of the rack, he admitted to the relationship. But his story was different from Manox's. Dereham claimed they'd had a pre-contract, a binding agreement to marry, that Catherine had been his wife, not the king's, that they'd exchanged vows, exchanged gifts, consummated their relationship, that it had been a real marriage, in everything but the formal ceremony. He argued that if Catherine had been pre-contracted to him, then her marriage to Henry was invalid. She wasn't an adulteress, she was a bigamist. It was a desperate attempt to save his life. And in a way, it made sense legally. If Catherine had been pre-contracted to Dereham, then technically she'd never been the king's lawful wife, which would make her guilty of deceiving the king, yes, but not of adultery. It might save her from execution, but it didn't work. If anything, it made things worse. Because if Catherine had been pre-contracted to Dereham, her marriage to Henry was invalid, which made her a bigamist, which meant she'd knowingly deceived the king about her marital status. And, possibly, this was the nightmare scenario, it made Prince Edward, Henry's precious son from Jane Seymour, illegitimate. Because if Henry's marriage to Catherine was invalid, and his previous marriage to Anne of Cleves had been annulled, and his marriage to Jane Seymour had ended with her death, then the succession was in chaos. The Howard family went into freefall. The Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's uncle, who'd orchestrated her rise to power, immediately distanced himself. He wrote letters to Henry, expressing his shock and horror at his niece's behaviour. He called her a whore. He said she'd deceived him too. He begged Henry to punish her, as an example to other women who might think of deceiving their husbands. Norfolk was trying to save himself, throwing his niece to the wolves to prove his loyalty to the king. The Dowager Duchess, in whose household Catherine had been raised, was arrested. She was in her 70s, frail and confused. She claimed she'd known nothing about the relationships. She'd been asleep, she said. She couldn't be expected to watch every girl, every minute of the day, but ignorance was no defence. She was accused of misprision of treason, knowing about a crime and failing to report it. Several of the women who'd lived in the dormitory with Catherine were also arrested. Joan Bulmer, who'd been Catherine's friend and confidant, Alice Restwold, who'd smuggled men into the dormitory, Catherine Tilney, who'd stood guard during the nighttime visits, Margaret Bennett, Malin Tilney, Alice Wilkes. One by one, they were rounded up, interrogated, and imprisoned. Everyone who'd known about Catherine's past was being punished. Everyone who'd kept her secrets was now paying the price. And through it all, Catherine herself was locked in her chambers at Hampton Court, stripped of her jewels and her title, not yet formally charged but no longer queen, waiting to learn her fate. And then the interrogators started asking about Thomas Culpeper, because someone, maybe one of the ladies in waiting, maybe a servant, maybe Jane Boleyn herself trying to deflect blame, had mentioned the meetings during the royal progress, the late-night visits, the letter Catherine had written, the way she'd looked at Culpeper during court functions. When Henry heard about Culpeper, something broke inside him. The relationships with Manox and Dereham had happened before Catherine married him. He could rationalise those, blame them on Catherine's youth and the poor supervision in the Dowager Duchess's household. But Culpeper? Culpeper was different. Culpeper was during their marriage. Culpeper was while she was queen, while she was sharing Henry's bed, while she was playing the devoted wife. Henry wept. According to reports, he actually wept in front of his council, something he'd never done before. He called for a sword, saying he would kill Catherine himself. He raged against the Howards, against women, against his own misfortune in marriage. How could this happen again? How could another wife betray him? But underneath the tears and the rage was something darker: humiliation. Because while Henry could convince himself that Anne Boleyn's alleged affairs had been fabricated, while he could tell himself that Catherine of Aragon had been stubborn but faithful, he couldn't deny the evidence about Catherine Howard. She'd met with Culpeper. She'd written him love letters. She'd called him to her chambers late at night. And everyone knew. The whole court knew. By now the gossip had spread everywhere. Everyone was whispering about the king's young wife and her handsome lover. Everyone was laughing at Henry behind their hands. The great king, the virile warrior, the head of the Church of England, cuckolded by a teenage girl and a minor courtier. Henry couldn't tolerate it. He couldn't survive the humiliation. And so Catherine Howard had to die. Catherine was placed under house arrest at Hampton Court. She was stripped of her title, her jewels, her gowns. Guards were posted at her door. Her ladies-in-waiting were replaced with women loyal to the king, women who would report every word she said. She was no longer queen. She was a prisoner, and she was terrified. At first, Catherine tried to deny everything. When the interrogators came, men she'd never met, men with hard faces and harder questions, she claimed Derham had forced himself on her, that Mannix had been inappropriate, but she'd been a child. She hadn't known what was happening, that she'd done nothing wrong since becoming queen, that the meetings with Culpeper had been innocent, just conversations, just a lonely queen seeking friendly company. But the interrogators didn't believe her. They had testimonies from the ladies-in-waiting. They had the letter she'd written to Culpeper. They had reports from servants about Jane Boleyn sneaking Culpeper into the Queen's chambers at midnight. They had witnesses who'd seen them together, heard them talking in low voices, noticed the way they looked at each other. The interrogation went on for days. Catherine was questioned for hours at a time, the same questions over and over, trying to catch her in contradictions. She wasn't allowed to sleep properly. She wasn't allowed to see anyone except her interrogators and her new attendants. The psychological pressure was immense, designed to break her down, to make her confess. And eventually, Catherine broke. She admitted to the relationships with Mannix and Derham. She provided details, dates, everything the interrogators wanted to know. She admitted to meeting with Culpeper. She admitted to writing him letters. But she swore, sobbing on her knees, begging them to believe her, that she'd never slept with Culpeper. That she'd been foolish, yes. Naive, yes. That she'd enjoyed his attention and company in a way that was probably inappropriate for a married woman. Yes, but not treasonous, not adulterous. She'd never actually betrayed her marriage vows. It didn't matter, because in Tudor law the intent to commit adultery was as serious as the act itself. Catherine had admitted she wanted Culpeper. She'd admitted she'd met with him in secret. She'd admitted she'd hidden these meetings from the king. And for a queen that was treason, because a queen's body belonged to the state. Any sexual contact, any romantic relationship outside of marriage, threatened the legitimacy of potential heirs. It didn't matter if she'd actually had sex with Culpeper or not. The fact that she'd wanted to was enough. Henry VIII didn't care whether Catherine had technically committed adultery. He cared that she'd made him look like a fool. He cared that the entire court was whispering about his young wife sneaking around with a handsome gentleman, while he, old and rotting and impotent, slept alone. He cared that she'd humiliated him, and for that she would die. On December 1st, 1541, Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were tried and convicted of treason. The trial was a formality. The verdict had been decided before it began. Both men were found guilty. Both were sentenced to death. Derham because he'd had a sexual relationship with Catherine before her marriage to the king and hadn't disclosed it, essentially deceiving the king about the Queen's virginity. Culpeper because he'd intended to commit adultery with the Queen. Intent was enough. On December 10th, they were executed at Tyburn, the main execution site in London, where crowds would gather to watch criminals die. Derham, as a commoner, and because Henry wanted to make an example of him, was given the full traitor's death. He was hanged by the neck until almost dead, but not quite. Then he was cut down while still conscious. His abdomen was sliced open and his intestines pulled out and burned in front of him while he was still alive. Then he was castrated. Only then was he finally beheaded. His suffering ended. His body was cut into quarters and displayed around London as a warning. Culpeper, as a gentleman, and because Henry still had some fondness for him, despite everything, was granted a quicker death. He was simply beheaded. One swing of the axe, relatively painless. His head, like Derham's, was placed on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for weeks, slowly rotting, picked at by crows, a reminder to everyone who passed of what happened to those who betrayed the king. Catherine, locked in her chambers at Hampton Court, would have heard the news, would have known that two men were dead because of her, would have known that she was next, and she would have known there was no escape, no last-minute pardon, no miracle. Henry wanted her dead, and what Henry wanted, Henry got. In January 1542, Parliament passed a bill of attainder against Catherine Howard. She was formally stripped of her title and declared guilty of treason. She wasn't given a trial. She didn't get to defend herself in court. The bill of attainder simply declared her guilty and sentenced her to death. It was a legal shortcut, a way for Henry to avoid the messiness of a public trial, where Catherine might say things that would embarrass him further. The charge wasn't just adultery, it was broader than that. She was accused of leading an abominable, base, carnal, voluptuous, and vicious life before her marriage to the king, of concealing this past from him, of bringing shame and dishonour to the royal marriage, of meeting with Culpeper with the intention of committing adultery, even if that intention was never fulfilled. And here's the truly chilling part. Parliament also passed a law making it treason for any future queen to marry the king without disclosing her sexual history. In other words, Catherine's death created a precedent. Any woman who married the king had to be a virgin or had to confess all previous sexual relationships. Anything less was punishable by death. It was a law designed to control women's bodies and sexuality, to make sure that kings could never again be deceived by non-virgin brides. It was Henry's revenge, codified in law. Catherine Howard would die, but her death would also serve as a warning to every future queen. Your body belongs to the state, and any attempt to hide your sexual past is a capital crime. On February 10th, 1542, Catherine was taken by barge from Hampton Court to the Tower of London. The same route Anne Boleyn had taken 6 years earlier. The same route that so many condemned prisoners had taken before her. It was a cold day, grey and drizzling. Catherine was no longer the giggling girl who charmed the king. She was pale, thin, shaking. She'd been locked up for months, interrogated, stripped of everything she'd ever known. She'd probably barely eaten, barely slept. She was a ghost of herself. The barge moved slowly down the Thames. Catherine sat in the centre, surrounded by guards, watching the banks of the river slide past. Did she think about running? About throwing herself into the water? About anything except the inevitable end waiting for her in the Tower? When they arrived at the Tower, Catherine was led through the Traitor's Gate, the water entrance where prisoners entered directly from the Thames. She was taken to the same apartments Anne Boleyn had been held in before her execution. Whether this was intentional cruelty or just practical logistics, we don't know. But Catherine would have known. She would have known that her cousin had died here, in this same place, accused of the same crimes. According to legend, Catherine spent her last night in the tower, practicing how to lay her head on the block. She asked her attendants to bring her the block so she could rehearse. She wanted to die gracefully. She didn't want to fumble, didn't want to have to be forced down, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her afraid or struggling. Can you imagine it? A 17-year-old girl, alone in a cold stone room, kneeling in front of a wooden block, practicing how to die, positioning her neck just so, making sure her hair wouldn't get in the way, making sure she could kneel without her skirts tripping her. Rehearsing the last moments of her life like it was a dance she had to get right. Whether this story is true or embellished legend, we don't know, but it's repeated in so many sources that there's probably some truth to it, and it tells us something about Catherine, that even at the end, even facing death, she was trying to perform, trying to be the graceful, obedient woman everyone expected her to be. Even in death, she couldn't just be herself. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. It was early, probably around 7 in the morning. The sky was grey, it was cold. She was probably 17 years old, maybe 18 at most, still a teenager, still young enough that if she'd been born in a different time, a different place, she might have been going to school, thinking about her future, living her life. Instead, she was about to die. There was no public execution, no massive crowd. This was a private killing, witnessed only by a small gathering of officials and nobles who were required to be present to confirm that the sentence had been carried out. Henry had learned from Anne Boleyn's execution that public spectacles could generate sympathy for the condemned, so Catherine's death would be quiet, hidden, quickly forgotten. Catherine was wearing a simple black dress, no jewels, no crown, nothing to mark her as the queen she'd briefly been. She climbed the steps to the scaffold. There were only 3 or 4 steps, but each one must have felt like a mountain. She stood on the wooden platform and looked out at the small crowd. Did she see any friendly faces, any compassion, or just cold stares and official indifference? She gave a short speech. The condemned were expected to speak, to confess their sins, and ask for forgiveness. Catherine didn't protest her innocence. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't rage against the injustice of her situation. She simply asked the crowd to pray for the king and to learn from her mistakes. She admitted she deserved death for her sins. It was what was expected of her. Even at the end, she performed the role of the penitent sinner. Then she knelt. A lady's maid helped her arrange her skirts so they wouldn't impede the executioner. Another helped her tuck her hair into her collar so her neck was bare. Catherine placed her head on the block, the same block she'd practiced with the night before. She'd gotten it right. Her neck was positioned perfectly. The executioner stepped forward. He was probably the same man who'd executed Anne Boleyn, an expert brought in from France who specialised in swift, clean beheadings. He raised the axe, and with one swing, it was over. Catherine Howard's head was severed from her body. Her blood spilled onto the wooden scaffold, pooling in the spaces between the boards. Her body slumped forward, and just like that, she was gone. The whole execution probably took less than 2 minutes from the time she stepped onto the scaffold to the moment she died. Her body was wrapped in cloth and carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, just a few yards from the scaffold. She was buried there, in the floor of the chapel, just a few feet from Anne Boleyn. 2 Howard women, 2 queens, 2 girls who'd been used by powerful men and discarded when they were no longer useful, both dead before they were 30, both buried in unmarked graves. Catherine Howard's grave wasn't marked. For centuries, no one knew exactly where she was buried. Visitors to the tower would walk over her bones without knowing. She'd been erased from history, forgotten, turned into a cautionary tale about wanton women and the dangers of female sexuality. But here's what haunts me about the whole thing. 10 minutes after Catherine died, Jane Boleyn was led to the same scaffold. Jane who'd arranged the meetings between Catherine and Culpeper. Jane who'd stood guard while they talked. Jane, who'd helped facilitate what the court called treason. At her trial, Jane had tried to claim insanity. She'd argued that she wasn't in her right mind, that she hadn't understood what she was doing. In modern terms, she might have been experiencing a mental breakdown. The stress of her position, the fear of being caught, the guilt over what might happen to Catherine. But in Tudor England, madness wasn't an excuse. It was an inconvenience. Henry actually had to pass a special law allowing for the execution of insane people, because technically, executing someone who was mentally incompetent was against both civil and church law. But Henry wanted Jane dead. She was a witness to his humiliation. She'd enabled his wife's betrayal. She had to be eliminated. So Parliament passed a law making it legal to execute her. And on February 13th, 1542, Jane Boleyn followed Catherine Howard to the scaffold. Jane's execution was messier. She was in her mid-30s, older than Catherine, and she'd been imprisoned for months. Some accounts suggest she was barely coherent, that she had to be supported as she walked to the scaffold. But she died the same way Catherine did. One swing of the axe, her head removed from her body, her blood mixing with Catherine's on the wooden boards. 2 women, both connected to the Boleyns, both destroyed by their proximity to power, and both buried together in that small chapel. Their graves unmarked, their stories twisted into legends about treacherous women who got what they deserved. Catherine Howard didn't die alone, and her story isn't just hers, it's the story of all the women who were caught in her orbit and destroyed. Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, was Catherine's step-grandmother and the woman in whose household Catherine was raised. After Catherine's fall, Agnes was arrested. She was in her 70s, frail, half-blind from cataracts, barely able to walk without assistance, but age and infirmity were no protection. She was accused of knowing about Catherine's past relationships and failing to disclose them to the king. The charges were serious. Concealing information about the Queen's sexual history was now legally defined as treason. Agnes was imprisoned in the Tower, along with several other members of the Howard household. She was questioned repeatedly, her answers recorded, her property seized. Agnes claimed she'd known nothing. She'd been asleep when the nighttime visits happened. She was old, she said, her hearing poor, her eyesight failing. She couldn't be expected to monitor every girl in her household every moment of the day. She'd trusted the older women to supervise. She'd assumed the girls were properly chaperoned. It wasn't her fault that Catherine had been deceitful, but ignorance was no defence. The court argued that, as head of the household, Agnes had a responsibility to ensure the moral behaviour of everyone under her roof. Her failure to do so had allowed Catherine to form inappropriate relationships, which she then concealed from the king, which had brought shame upon the crown. Agnes's negligence was therefore treasonous. She was found guilty. Her property, lands, money, household goods, was forfeit to the crown. She was released from the Tower eventually, probably because Henry didn't want to execute a 70-something-year-old woman and make himself look even more tyrannical. But she was financially ruined, socially destroyed, her reputation in tatters. She died in 1545, 3 years after Catherine's execution, broken and impoverished, having lost everything because she hadn't watched the girls in her household closely enough. Joan Bulmer, Catherine Tilney, Margaret Bennet, Alice Restwold, Malin Tilney, Alice Wilkes. These women had lived with Catherine in the Dowager Duchess's household. They'd witnessed the relationships with Manox and Derham. Some had even participated, sneaking men into the dormitory, standing guard, giggling in the dark about the forbidden romance happening behind the bed curtains. When Catherine fell, they were all arrested. One by one, the king's men came for them. They were taken from their homes, from their families, and imprisoned in the Tower. They were interrogated for months, sometimes separately, sometimes together. The interrogators tried to catch them in contradictions, to force them to provide more details about Catherine's past. Some of them tried to minimise their involvement. They claimed they'd only known vaguely about the relationships. that they hadn't realised how serious they were, that they'd assumed it was innocent young love. Others tried to deflect blame onto Catherine, painting her as the seductress, the one who'd pursued the men. It was a desperate attempt to save themselves, and it came at Catherine's expense. None of them were executed, but their lives were ruined. Some were imprisoned for months before being released. Others were released quickly, but had to live under restrictions. They couldn't travel, couldn't work in noble households, were essentially under house arrest. Their reputations were destroyed. Who would employ a woman who'd been implicated in the Queen's downfall? Who would marry them? Their families were disgraced by association. They were guilty of the same thing Catherine was, being young women in a world that punished female sexuality. They giggled about boys, snuck men into their dormitory, helped their friend meet with her lover. Normal teenage behaviour, but because one of those teenagers happened to become queen, that behaviour became treason. And then there's Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife, whom he'd divorced just months before marrying Catherine. Anne had been smart. When Henry decided he didn't want to be married to her anymore, when he found her physically repulsive and wanted out, she didn't fight. She didn't protest or claim her rights as his lawful wife. She simply agreed to the annulment, accepted a generous settlement, and retired to the countryside. She'd been given several estates, a substantial income, and the title of the King's beloved sister. She lived quietly, managing her properties, staying out of court politics, never remarrying. And when Catherine Howard was arrested, tried and executed, Anne of Cleves stayed silent. She didn't gloat, she didn't comment, she just kept living her quiet, careful life. And it worked. Anne outlived Catherine. She outlived Henry, who died in 1547. She outlived Edward VI, Henry's son, who died in 1553. She even outlived Mary I, Henry's daughter, who died in 1558. Anne of Cleves died in 1537, wealthy, independent, and unmarried. She'd survived 4 monarchs, countless political upheavals, and the dangerous proximity to Henry VIII. Her survival strategy? Compliance. She gave Henry what he wanted, an easy exit from an unwanted marriage. She didn't make demands or create problems. She accepted her fate gracefully, and then disappeared from public view. And in return, she got to live. She got to grow old, something most of Henry's wives never achieved. Catherine Howard, young and naive and desperate to be loved, never learned that lesson. She thought being queen meant power. She thought being pretty and charming would protect her. She thought love mattered, and she was wrong on every count. Let's talk about what happened to Henry after Catherine's death, because his reaction tells us everything about what this was really about. When Catherine Howard was executed, Henry VIII had been married to her for less than 2 years. He'd called her his rose without a thorn, his jewel of womanhood, his perfect queen. He'd showered her with gifts and affection. He'd paraded her around court like a trophy. And when he found out about her past, about the meetings with Culpeper, about the letters and the lies, he reportedly wept. According to multiple sources, Henry actually cried in front of his council. He lamented his misfortune in marriage. He cursed the Howards for deceiving him. He called for a sword, saying he would kill Catherine himself with his own hands. But he didn't. He let the law do it. Because even in his rage, even in his pain, Henry understood the theatre of power. An execution was more effective than a murder, more legal, more controlled. It sent a message. No one betrays the king and lives. Not wives, not counsellors, not friends, no one. And then, less than 6 weeks after Catherine's death, Henry was courting again. By March 1542, just a month after the execution, he was already looking for wife number 6. He was making inquiries about potential candidates, considering which foreign princess or English noblewoman might suit him next. By July 1543, just 16 months after Catherine's execution, Henry married his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr. She was 31, twice widowed, and smart enough to know exactly what she was getting into. She survived Henry by being careful, by never giving him a reason to doubt her loyalty, by playing the role of devoted wife and stepmother to his children. Henry moved on, quickly, easily, efficiently, because for Henry, wives were replaceable. They were political tools, breeding stock, sources of comfort and entertainment. When one failed, you got another. It was that simple. But here's the thing that haunts me about Henry's reaction to Catherine's fall. He was devastated, genuinely devastated. You can see it in the reports of his behaviour, the weeping, the rage, the depression that followed. But it wasn't because he loved Catherine. It was because she'd made him feel old. Catherine Howard was young, pretty, fun. She made Henry feel like the virile king he used to be, not the bloated, rotting tyrant he'd become. She laughed at his jokes. She danced with him. She pretended he was handsome and desirable. She sold him a fantasy of himself, and he'd bought it completely. And when he found out she'd been with other men, younger men, healthier men, men who didn't smell like death and could actually perform sexually, it shattered that illusion. It wasn't about betrayal, not really. It was about ego. It was about vanity. It was about the terrible realization that he wasn't the man he used to be, and no amount of power or wealth or fear could change that. Henry couldn't stand the idea that Catherine preferred someone else, that she'd looked at him, old and decaying and impotent, and chosen to seek comfort elsewhere, that she'd probably been disgusted by him, repulsed by his body, bored by his company, that when she was with him, she was probably thinking about Culpeper. So he killed her. Not because she'd committed treason, not because she'd threatened the succession, but because an old man's vanity couldn't survive her youth. And that, more than anything, is what makes Catherine Howard's story so tragic. She died not because she was guilty, but because she'd reminded a powerful man that he was no longer the centre of the universe. Now let's talk about what it actually meant to be Queen in Tudor England. Because the title sounds glamorous, but the reality was a nightmare of surveillance, expectation, and constant danger. A queen had one primary duty: produce male heirs. That's it. Everything else was secondary. If you succeeded, you were celebrated. If you failed, you were expendable. The numbers tell the story. Catherine of Aragon gave Henry 6 children. Only one, Mary, survived past infancy. Henry divorced her after 24 years of marriage, claiming their marriage had never been valid because she'd briefly been married to his brother Arthur. He spent years trying to get the Pope to annul the marriage. When the Pope refused, Henry broke with Rome, established himself as head of the Church of England, and divorced Catherine anyway. She died abandoned, forbidden from seeing her daughter, still insisting she was his true wife. Anne Boleyn gave Henry one daughter, Elizabeth, and then miscarried a son. That was it. 3 years of marriage, 1 living child, and Henry had her executed on fabricated charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Most historians now agree the charges were false, manufactured to give Henry a legal excuse to get rid of a wife who hadn't produced a male heir. Jane Seymour gave Henry a son, Edward. She died 12 days later from childbirth complications, probably from an infection. Henry mourned her as his true wife because she'd done the one thing that mattered. She'd given him a male heir. The fact that it killed her was irrelevant. She'd fulfilled her purpose. Anne of Cleves didn't get pregnant in the 6 months she was queen. Henry divorced her, claiming non-consummation. She was smart enough to accept the divorce gracefully and lived the rest of her life in comfortable retirement. Catherine Howard didn't get pregnant in the 16 months she was queen. She was executed for treason, but really, she was executed for failing to produce an heir and embarrassing the king in the process. Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th wife, didn't get pregnant either, but she outlived him, so it didn't matter. She married a 4th time after Henry's death and died in childbirth a year later, finally succumbing to the same fate that killed so many Tudor women. The message was clear. Your value as a queen was determined by your womb. And if your womb didn't cooperate, if you didn't produce the right kind of children at the right time, you were disposable. But producing heirs wasn't the only pressure. Queens were expected to navigate an impossible maze of contradictory demands. Be beautiful, but not vain. If you spent too much time on your appearance, you were frivolous. If you didn't look perfect at all times, you were slovenly and disrespecting your position. Be charming, but not flirtatious. Smile at courtiers and make them feel welcome, but don't smile too much, or you're a seductress, trying to seduce men other than your husband. Be intelligent, but not opinionated. Show interest in politics and religion, but never express your own views, or you're overstepping your role as a woman. Be pious, but not fanatical. Attend Mass and pray regularly, but don't get too involved in theological debates, or you're meddling in men's business. Be fertile, but not sexual. Produce children, but never acknowledge that you enjoy sex or have sexual desires of your own. It was an impossible standard, and every queen who failed to meet it in some way was punished. Catherine Howard was punished for being too sexual, for having a past, for wanting affection and pleasure. Anne Boleyn was punished for being too ambitious, too outspoken, too willing to challenge Henry. Catherine of Aragon was punished for not producing a male heir, even though the sex of the child wasn't in her control. Jane Seymour was killed by the very act of giving Henry what he wanted most. There was no winning. The game was rigged from the start, and every queen knew it, even if they pretended otherwise. And let's talk about the surveillance, because this is crucial to understanding why Catherine's secret meetings with Culpeper were doomed from the start. Being queen meant living in a fishbowl, where every moment was observed, recorded, and judged. Every room had servants, every conversation had listeners, every letter was read, every movement tracked. You couldn't have a private moment, ever. Even in your bedchamber, ladies in waiting slept on trundle beds around you, ready to assist you at any moment. They dressed you, bathed you, attended to your bodily functions. They watched you eat, watched you pray, watched you sleep. Privacy didn't exist, and those ladies, they were spies. Not in a coordinated way necessarily, but everyone at court understood that information was currency. If you saw something interesting, the Queen looking sad, the Queen writing a letter, the Queen whispering with a particular courtier, you reported it to your family, to your patrons, to anyone who might reward you for the information. This wasn't paranoia. This was how the Tudor court functioned. Everyone was watching everyone else, looking for advantages, for leverage, for pieces of information that might be valuable. Loyalty to the Queen came second to loyalty to your own survival and advancement. So when Catherine Howard tried to sneak around with Thomas Culpeper, she wasn't just being reckless, she was attempting the impossible, having a private life in a world designed to eliminate privacy. She thought Jane Boleyn was helping her out of friendship or loyalty. She probably didn't realise that Jane might be keeping records of the meetings, might be protecting herself by documenting everything in case it all went wrong. She thought the other ladies in waiting were asleep or not paying attention. She didn't realise they were noting every time Jane left the room late at night, every time Culpeper was spotted in the wrong part of the palace, every flushed look and whispered conversation. She failed. Of course she failed, because the system was designed to make her fail. Privacy was a luxury queens couldn't afford. Love was a danger queens couldn't risk. And Catherine, young and naive and desperate, didn't understand that until it was too late. So was Catherine Howard a victim or a schemer? Let's look at the evidence with clear eyes. The case for victim. Catherine was a child throughout most of her story. At every stage she was vulnerable, exploited, and manipulated by people with more power. Henry Manox was her teacher. He was an adult. She was 13. That's not a romance, that's abuse. It doesn't matter if she consented. Children can't meaningfully consent to sexual activity with adults, especially adults in positions of authority. Manox groomed her, touched her, initiated a sexual relationship with her. By any modern standard, he was a predator. Francis Derham was in his 20s. She was 15, maybe 16. He called her his wife and had sex with her in a dormitory full of people who could have stopped it but didn't. That's not love. That's coercion. That's a man taking advantage of a girl who didn't understand she had the right to say no. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, used her as a political pawn. He pushed her into the king's path, knowing full well what could happen. He didn't care about her safety or her happiness. He cared about power. He cared about restoring the Howard family's influence at court. And when it all went wrong, when Catherine fell, he abandoned her immediately. He called her a whore and begged Henry to execute her. Henry VIII married a teenager, paraded her around court, and then had her executed when she didn't meet his impossible standards. He was 50 years old, she was 17, he was the most powerful man in England. She was a minor noblewoman with no resources, no education, no power of her own. The relationship was inherently abusive from the start. Even Thomas Culpeper, charming, handsome Culpeper, was dangerous. He had a history of violence. He'd raped a woman and murdered a man who tried to stop him. And Catherine, lonely and desperate for affection, had no way of knowing what kind of man he really was. She saw what he wanted her to see, a young, attractive man who paid attention to her. Every man in her life took something from her, and in the end, they took her life. By this reading, Catherine Howard was a victim of a system that consumed young women and spit them out when they were no longer useful. She never had a chance. But here's the other reading, the one that gives Catherine more agency, more intelligence, the case for schemer. Catherine wasn't stupid. She'd grown up in the Howard household. She knew how power worked. She knew her family's history. Anne Boleyn had been queen, and she'd been executed. Catherine knew the stakes. She'd watched her uncle navigate court politics. She'd seen how dangerous it was to be close to power. And yet, she still met with Culpeper. She still wrote him letters. She still took the risk. Maybe she wasn't naive. Maybe she was calculating. Maybe she thought she could manage Henry, charm Culpeper, and secure her position through strategic alliances. Maybe she was playing the only game available to her, and she almost won. After all, Catherine wasn't just a passive victim. She made choices. She agreed to marry Henry. Yes, her family pushed her into it, but she could have refused. She could have fled, joined a convent, done something. But she didn't. She saw an opportunity and she took it. She participated in the nighttime meetings with Culpeper. She sent for him. She wrote him love letters. She knew what she was doing was dangerous and she did it anyway. That's not naivety. That's active choice. Maybe she was trying to secure a backup plan. Maybe she knew Henry was old and sick and might die soon. Maybe she was cultivating Culpeper as a potential husband for after Henry's death. Maybe she was smarter than anyone gave her credit for. By this reading, Catherine Howard was a young woman trying to survive in a world that gave her no good options. And when survival meant risk, she took it. She played the game. She just lost. But here's the thing, and this is what I keep coming back to. It's not either or. Life isn't that simple. People aren't that simple. Catherine Howard was both. She was a victim of a brutal misogynistic system that treated women as commodities, that married children to old men, that punished female sexuality while celebrating male violence. That's undeniable. And she was also a young woman who made choices, some smart, some reckless, some desperate. She wasn't a helpless victim with no agency, but she also wasn't a scheming seductress manipulating everyone around her. She was 17 years old, trying to survive in an impossible situation, making the best choices she could with the limited information and resources she had. She was groomed by Manox. She was coerced by Derham. She was used by her family. She was entrapped by a king who wanted a fantasy, not a person. But she also sought comfort, connection, maybe even love, in a world that offered her none. She made mistakes, but she also had no good options. Every path led to danger. She chose the path that seemed least dangerous at the time, and it killed her. She wasn't a saint, but she wasn't a villain either. She was human, flawed, complicated, desperate, hopeful, scared. She was a girl who wanted to be loved, who wanted to feel safe, who wanted to matter. And she lived in a world where women were only allowed to matter in one way, by serving men. Catherine Howard wasn't any of those things. She was loud when she should have been quiet. She was reckless when she should have been careful. She wanted things, affection, freedom, pleasure, that queens weren't supposed to want. And the Tudor world couldn't tolerate that. So it killed her, not because she was evil, not because she was dangerous, but because she was inconvenient, because she'd reminded a powerful man of his own mortality and impotence, because her existence challenged the fantasy that powerful men told themselves about their own virility and desirability. And that's the real tragedy. We want Catherine to be one thing. We want her to be innocent, so we can feel righteous in our anger at her treatment. Or we want her to be guilty, so we can justify what happened to her, so we can tell ourselves that if she'd just behaved differently, if she'd just been better, she would have survived. But she's neither, and she's both. She made mistakes, she also had no good options, she sought connection, she also put herself in danger, she trusted people, she also ignored warning signs. She was 17, and she's been dead for 483 years, and we're still arguing about whether she deserved it. Maybe that's the real tragedy. Catherine Howard died on February 13, 1542. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower of London. For centuries, no one knew exactly where she was. Her grave wasn't labelled, wasn't honoured, wasn't remembered. She'd been a queen, but in death she was nothing. Just another body in the ground. Just another woman who'd been used and discarded by powerful men. In 1876, during renovations of the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the Tower of London, workers uncovered the remains of several people buried beneath the floor. The chapel had been the burial place for many executed prisoners over the centuries, and the bodies had been hastily interred, often in unmarked graves, sometimes several to a single burial spot. Among the remains they found Anne Boleyn, identified by the position of her grave near the altar, Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, who'd been executed in 1554, and Catherine Howard, buried just feet away from her cousin Anne. 2 queens, 2 Howards, both executed for sexual crimes, both dead before they were 30, both forgotten by history until archaeologists dug them up centuries later. The remains were studied, documented, and then reinterred with simple plaques marking their locations. Now, visitors to the Tower of London can see where Catherine Howard rests. They can stand in the chapel and look at the floor and know that beneath their feet lies a teenage girl who died because she wanted to be loved. But even now, in death, Catherine Howard doesn't get the last word. Historians argue about her. Was she a victim or a schemer? Was she abused or complicit? Was she manipulated or manipulative? Novelists reimagine her, writing books that try to fill in the gaps in her story, try to give her the voice she never had in life. Filmmakers dramatize her, casting actresses to play her in movies and TV shows. She's been portrayed as innocent and tragic, as calculating and seductive, as naive and foolish. Everyone has an opinion about Catherine Howard, except Catherine Howard herself, because she never got to tell her own story. She wasn't educated enough to write a memoir. She didn't leave behind letters defending herself. The few letters we have were used as evidence against her. Her voice was silenced on a scaffold in 1542, and it's never been recovered. So instead, we project, we imagine, we argue, and maybe that's what ghosts are, not spirits in castles, but silences we can't stop trying to fill. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, for sitting with Catherine's story, for thinking about her not as a cautionary tale or a historical footnote or a slutty queen who got what she deserved, but as a real person, a girl who laughed and cried and made mistakes and wanted to be loved, a girl who died too young in a world that gave her no chance to grow old. Maybe that's all history really is, the attempt to fill those silences, to speak for those who can't speak for themselves, to remember those who are meant to be forgotten. Catherine Howard's voice was taken from her 5 centuries ago, but as long as we keep telling her story, as long as we keep asking questions, as long as we refuse to let her fade into the stone walls of the tower, she hasn't been silenced completely. Good night. Sleep well. And remember, the past isn't as far away as we like to think. The systems that killed Catherine Howard, that punished women for their sexuality, that treated girls as commodities, that gave old men power over young women's bodies, those systems still exist. They've evolved, they've adapted, but they're still here. So when you hear Catherine's story, don't just hear it as history, hear it as a warning and a reminder that power hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe, that young women are still vulnerable to predatory men, that society still blames victims for their abuse, that we still ask women to be perfect while forgiving men for being monsters. Catherine Howard died 483 years ago, but her story is still being written in every courtroom where a woman's sexual history is used against her, in every workplace where young women are harassed by powerful men, in every family where girls are told their bodies don't belong to them. Her story isn't over, it's just wearing different clothes. Rest well, Catherine. Your suffering wasn't meaningless, your story matters, and you deserved so much better than what the world gave you.